Hey there. Tonight we're descending into the depths, not to places of fire and torment as you might imagine, but to a realm of shadows and silence where every mortal journey eventually ends. We're following the entire story of Hades, the god who never asked to rule the dead, who drew the shortest straw and made the best of eternity in darkness. You'll drift through the life of the most misunderstood god in Greek mythology, from the moment he was born and immediately swallowed by his father, through the war that freed him, to the endless halls where he became king of the dead. You'll meet the woman he loved enough to steal, the heroes brave enough to visit his realm, and the souls who learned that death, at least under Hades, was fair. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to these ancient stories of gods and the dead. So close your eyes. Let the darkness settle around you like a comfortable blanket. Let the myths unfold like shadows on a wall, and let's begin at the very beginning, before Hades was a king, before he was even free. The first into darkness. Hades was born first. That simple fact would define everything that came after. Not because being eldest gave him any advantages in the world of the Greek gods, where power mattered more than birth order, but because being first meant he was the first experiment in his father's paranoia, the first victim of Cronus's terrible solution to a prophecy problem. His mother was Rhea, a titaness of fertility and motherhood and the flowing generations of time. She was patient, loving, and trapped in a marriage to someone who'd been twisted by fear into something barely recognizable as the being she'd once known. His father was Cronus, lord of the cosmos during the Golden Age, who had seized power by castrating his own father Uranus with a sickle forged by Gaia. Cronus knew what children could do to parents because he'd done it himself, and a prophecy had warned him that history would repeat, that one of his children would overthrow him just as he'd overthrown Uranus. Paranoia makes monsters of everyone eventually, even Titan kings. Cronus decided the solution was simple. He would prevent his children from overthrowing him by preventing them from existing outside his control, not by killing them, which might offend cosmic law or anger Gaia or create other problems, but by keeping them inside him, literally. He would swallow each child at birth, keep them trapped in his body where they couldn't grow into threats. When Rhea gave birth to Hades, when she held that newborn god in her arms and looked into eyes that were already ancient in some way, already serious, she hoped that Cronus would change his mind, that seeing his actual son, holding this tiny divine being who'd done nothing wrong, would break through the paranoia and remind Cronus what love felt like. She begged him to reconsider, to find another solution, to at least give their child a chance at life. Cronus took the infant from her arms without hesitation and swallowed him whole. The physics of how this worked, how a newborn god fits down a throat, how existence continues inside another being's body, the myths don't explain in detail. But Hades went from his mother's arms into darkness in seconds, from first breath of air into whatever strange atmosphere existed inside Cronus, from the possibility of life into a prison where time moved wrongly, and hope seemed like a concept from another universe entirely. That first swallowing must have been traumatic in ways even divine psychology struggles to process. One moment, existence, light, warmth, his mother's face, the sensation of being held. The next moment, darkness so complete it became a physical presence. No light, no air as he'd just learned to breathe it. no space except the oppressive confines of his father's body. Just darkness, heat, the rhythmic sounds of Cronus's heartbeat and digestion, and the terrible understanding that this was punishment for the crime of being born. But gods don't die from trauma. They don't stop developing because circumstances are terrible. In that darkness, Hades grew. From infant to child to youth to fully mature god, he aged through stages that should have required sunlight and space and interaction with the world. Instead, he grew in a womb that wasn't meant for growth, in darkness that should have destroyed development, but instead shaped it in strange ways. Time worked oddly inside Cronus. It might have been years, decades, centuries. Hades couldn't measure it because there was nothing to measure against. Just the eternal present of imprisonment, the endless now of being trapped, the perpetual darkness that became his entire world. He developed consciousness in that dark, learned to think without stimulus, grew into his power without anywhere to use it. He was alone at first, the eldest, the only, the first experiment in divine imprisonment. He had no one to talk to, no one to share the darkness with, no one to confirm that this was real, and not some nightmare his infant mind had conjured, just himself, and the darkness and the slow accumulation of rage that builds when you've been wronged before you had any chance to do wrong yourself. Then, after however long it took for Rhea to give birth again, his sister Hestia arrived, swallowed just as he had been, dropped into the darkness to join him. Then Demeter, then Hera, then Poseidon. Each time, Hades felt a complicated mixture of emotions that he was still too young to fully process. Relief at not being alone, grief that his siblings were suffering his fate, rage at their father for continuing this cruelty, but also, perhaps, a growing sense of purpose. If they were all trapped here together, if they were all growing stronger in ways Cronus couldn't see or stop, then perhaps one day, somehow, things would change. Hades became, in that darkness, something like a guardian to his younger siblings. Not that he could protect them from the imprisonment they all shared, but he could help them understand it, accept it, endure it. He was the eldest, not just by birth, but by experience. He'd been in the darkness longest, understood its nature most completely, had learned how to exist inside it without going completely mad. He taught them, in whatever way trapped divine children can teach each other, that rage without patience accomplishes nothing. That power without opportunity is just potential waiting for circumstances to change. That acceptance isn't the same as surrender. You can accept circumstances you can't currently change while remaining ready for the moment when change becomes possible. The darkness shaped each of them differently. Poseidon learned fury and the need to prove himself, emerged from imprisonment, ready to make the world acknowledge him. Hera learned pride and the dangerous lesson that showing weakness invites exploitation. Demeter learned to value what you lose and fight desperately to get it back. Hestia learned quiet endurance and the value of being constant when everything else shifts. But Hades learned acceptance, true acceptance, not the broken resignation that looks similar from outside but feels entirely different from inside. He learned that some things simply are, that fighting against unchangeable circumstances wastes energy better spent on enduring them, that patience outlasts almost everything else, and that darkness is not inherently evil or frightening once you stop fearing it and simply exist within it. He learned that being unseen doesn't mean being worthless, that silence has its own kind of power, that the eldest child is often the forgotten one, the practice run, the one who bears the most burden and receives the least acknowledgement. He learned these lessons without bitterness, or perhaps with bitterness that transformed into something else over the endless time of imprisonment, something more useful than simple anger. In the darkness of Cronus's belly, Hades was being prepared for a role he didn't know existed yet, training for a kingdom he'd never asked for, learning patience and acceptance and dignity in suffering that would serve him well when he eventually became king of a realm where patience and acceptance and dignity were the only qualities that mattered. But he didn't know this yet. He just knew he was trapped, that his father had swallowed him at birth, that his siblings kept arriving to share his imprisonment, that they were all growing stronger without any way to use that strength. He knew he was angry, but had learned to keep that anger cold rather than hot, controlled rather than explosive. He knew he was powerful, but trapped, capable, but imprisoned, divine, but denied any divinity except the bare fact of existence. Then everything changed. Zeus, their youngest brother, the one Rhea had finally managed to save through desperate trickery, came to them not as a conquering hero, but as a servant with poison. He'd infiltrated Cronus's court disguised as a cupbearer, had gained enough trust to serve wine directly to the Titan king, and in that wine was a potion brewed by Gaia that would force Cronus's body to reject everything it had swallowed. When Cronus drank, when the potion hit his system, when his body finally rebelled against the unnatural contents it had been holding, the vomiting began. First came the stone Rhea had substituted for Zeus, the decoy baby wrapped in swaddling clothes that Cronus had swallowed without bothering to check. It crashed to the ground with world-shaking force. Then came the children, in reverse order of swallowing. Poseidon emerged first among them, already thinking about oceans and power and making the world acknowledge him. Then Hera, calculating and proud even in her first moments of freedom. Then Demeter and Hestia, blinking in light they'd never seen as free beings. And finally, Hades, the eldest, the first swallowed, emerged last from his father's throat. Or perhaps he deliberately waited, one final act of guardianship, making sure his younger siblings got out first before he took his own freedom. Either way, when Hades stepped into the light for the first time in his existence, when he breathed air that wasn't filtered through his father's lungs, when he saw colors and shapes and distances after nothing but darkness for however many years or centuries it had been, the world must have seemed both overwhelming and impossibly beautiful. He stood taller than mortal men would ever stand, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of kingdoms, with eyes that had learned to see in absolute darkness and now had to adjust to light. He was fully grown, fully powerful, fully divine. The darkness had shaped him, but not broken him. The imprisonment had taught him, but not destroyed him. He was Hades, eldest of Zeus's siblings, first victim of Cronus's paranoia, and he was finally, impossibly, free. He looked at Zeus, this younger brother who'd saved them all, who'd risked everything to free siblings he'd never met, who'd thought of a plan clever enough to work. He looked at Cronus, weakened by the potion, coughing and stumbling, suddenly vulnerable for the first time in his reign. He looked at his other siblings, adjusting to freedom, processing what had just happened, beginning to understand that liberty had a price, and that price would be paid in war. Hades said nothing. He'd learned silence in the darkness, learned that words often accomplish less than quiet action, learned that sometimes the most powerful response is simply to wait and see what happens next. He just stood there, free for the first time, and when Zeus declared they would fight, when Zeus rallied them to war against Cronus and the Titans, Hades simply nodded. He didn't want war, but he didn't want to return to darkness either. So he would fight, because fighting was necessary, because some things can only be resolved through violence, because freedom required them to destroy the ones who'd imprisoned them. He would fight with the same patient intensity he brought to everything, without rage or enthusiasm, just with methodical determination to see this through to whatever ending it required. The Titanomachy. War in the shadows. The war that followed liberation lasted 10 years, a decade of violence that cracked mountains and boiled seas, made sky weep and earth groan, transformed cosmos from what it had been under Titans into something new and terrible and necessary. The Titanomachy, war between old gods and new, between ancient power and furious youth, between those who'd ruled and those who'd been swallowed. This wasn't just a battle for territory or resources. This was existential. If the young gods lost, they would be imprisoned again, swallowed again, trapped in darkness forever, with no hope of second rescue. Hades fought in that war every day for 10 years, and his contribution was perhaps more crucial than most stories acknowledge, because stories prefer dramatic, visible actions to quiet, essential ones. Zeus threw lightning everyone could see, brilliant and loud and impressive. It was the kind of power that made enemies flinch, that demonstrated raw strength, that looked magnificent in the moment, and would look magnificent when bards sang about it later. Poseidon sent floods that reshaped landscapes, his power obvious and destructive, leaving evidence of his strength carved into the very geography of battlefields. But Hades fought differently, fought in ways that terrified enemies more than visible power ever could, fought as someone who'd learned to exist in darkness and now had weapons making darkness his advantage. His war was quieter, but no less important. While his brothers announced their presence with thunder and tidal waves, Hades simply disappeared. When Zeus descended into Tartarus to free the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires, imprisoned giants and craftsmen locked away since beginning of time, he was making a calculated gamble. These beings had been locked up by Uranus for being too powerful, too strange, too unpredictable. When Cronus had overthrown Uranus, he'd kept them imprisoned rather than risk freeing them. But Zeus understood that desperate times required desperate allies, that winning this war meant finding every advantage possible. The Cyclopes were grateful enough to forge gifts for 3 brothers who'd freed them. These weren't just weapons. These were extensions of the gods themselves, tools perfectly suited to their natures, crafted with understanding of who each god was and what kind of power they needed. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, not a single bolt of lightning, but the power to call storms from clear skies, to turn the heavens into his personal arsenal, to make thunder his voice and lightning his judgment. It was visible, dramatic, the kind of weapon that made everyone on the battlefield stop and look, that demonstrated power in ways impossible to ignore. It suited Zeus perfectly, this god who would become king, who needed his authority to be obvious and unquestionable. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, 3-pronged force that could shake earth and sea, that could split mountains or calm storms, that gave him dominion over his eventual realm in ways both literal and symbolic. It was powerful, impressive, the kind of weapon that made oceans rise and earth crack. It suited Poseidon's volatile nature, his need to make the world acknowledge him, his desire for power that others could see and fear. And for Hades, they crafted something different, something that fit him perfectly, the helm of darkness. It wasn't a weapon in traditional sense. You couldn't strike enemies with it or throw it or use it to block attacks. You couldn't point at someone and make them die or trap them or harm them directly. What it did was simpler and, in its own way, more powerful. It made the wearer completely invisible, not just invisible to eyes, but to all senses, all methods of detection. You couldn't see someone wearing the helm, couldn't hear them or smell them or sense them with divine perception, or track them with magic. They became shadow among shadows, less than ghost, more absent than absent, unseen and unstoppable. The Cyclopes had looked at Hades, this quiet god who'd spent his entire life in darkness, who moved with stillness of deep water, who spoke rarely and observed constantly, who'd endured imprisonment without breaking, and they understood what he needed. Not flashy power to announce presence, but tools to make presence impossible to detect. Not a weapon that declared, "I am here and I am powerful," but one that whispered, "You never saw me coming." They gave him ability to weaponize what he'd already become during his imprisonment: invisible, patient, inevitable. In Cronus's belly, Hades had been unseen for years or centuries. The Cyclopes simply gave him a way to choose invisibility rather than having it forced upon him. With Helm of Darkness, Hades became war's perfect stealth operative, the assassin that couldn't be caught, the spy that couldn't be detected, the force that undermined enemies from within while they focused on threats they could actually see. While Zeus and Poseidon fought on front lines, drawing attention and engaging enemies directly, Hades would simply put on helm and disappear. One moment he would be visible among his siblings, standing in war councils, discussing strategy. The next moment, nothing, empty space where God had been. And then, miles away, Titan commanders would fall to invisible strikes. Important leaders would collapse mid-speech, cut down by blades they never saw. Supply lines carefully guarded would be cut by unseen hands. Weapons would vanish from, supposedly, secure armories overnight. Plans discussed in locked rooms would somehow reach Zeus's ears. The Titans grew paranoid in ways that undermined their unity more effectively than any frontal assault could have. How do you fight an enemy you can't perceive? How do you defend against attacks that come from nowhere? They posted extra guards, doubling and tripling security around important locations. But guards can't stop what they can't see. They developed passwords and recognition signals, ways to identify allies. But Hades would overhear those passwords while invisible and use them himself. They changed their tactics constantly, assuming their plans had been compromised, which they had, because Hades would overhear new tactics being discussed and report them to Zeus before they could be implemented. They tried to set traps, leaving false information in places where spies might overhear it, hoping to catch whoever was stealing their secrets. But you can't trap a shadow that's not really there, that leaves no footprints, makes no sound, disturbs nothing as it passes. Hades moved through war like death itself, appropriate given what he would become. Enemies never saw him coming, never heard approach, never had warning or chance to defend. They just suddenly found themselves defeated by attacker who'd vanished before they could respond, leaving only bodies behind as evidence anyone had been there at all. He was inevitable in way death is inevitable, unstoppable, not through raw force, but through perfect stealth, combined with infinite patience learned from years of forced waiting in darkness. He didn't enjoy the killing. That's important to understand, crucial to understanding who Hades was. Poseidon seemed to revel in battle, in proving strength, in making world tremble before power. You could hear it in the way he fought, with enthusiasm and energy and a kind of joy in demonstrating what he could do. Zeus carried himself with confidence of someone who knew victory was destiny, who fought like someone already picturing the throne he'd sit on after winning, who seemed to be enjoying the challenge. But Hades fought because it was necessary, not because it brought satisfaction. He killed when killing shortened war, when removing a particular Titan commander would save more lives on his side than it cost. He sabotaged because sabotage prevented larger battles that would kill hundreds on both sides. He spied because information prevented catastrophic mistakes, warned of ambushes, revealed weak points that could be exploited without massive bloodshed. Every action had purpose beyond simple violence. He took no pleasure in any of it, no satisfaction in victories, no joy in successful missions, no pride in being invisible killer that enemies couldn't stop. It was just work, necessary, unpleasant work that someone had to do, and he was best suited for it, so he did it without complaint and without seeking acknowledgement. He was discovering something about himself in that war, something that would define his future role more than he could have imagined. He was good at necessary, unpleasant work, good at doing things that needed doing even when they brought no glory, no acknowledgement, no satisfaction. Good at existing in darkness, both literal and figurative, at being unseen hand that made visible victories possible, at accepting that his contribution would never be properly celebrated because celebrating invisible work is difficult. When bards sang about the Titanomachy later, they would sing about Zeus's lightning-splitting mountains, about Poseidon's floods reshaping continents, about the Hecatoncheires throwing boulders with their 100 hands. They wouldn't sing about Hades, because how do you sing about someone who was never seen? How do you celebrate victories won by someone whose presence couldn't be confirmed? His war was a war of shadows and silence, and such wars don't inspire songs. The war dragged on for what felt like forever. Years became half-decade, became nearly full decade of constant fighting, constant vigilance, constant sacrifice on both sides. Battles were fought and refought over same territories, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Mountains that had stood since creation were split and scattered. Rivers were diverted or dried up entirely. Whole regions of the world were reshaped by the violence, geography rewritten by gods at war. The Titans were being worn down, but not through dramatic victories. Through accumulation of small defeats, most of which Hades enabled but would never receive credit for. A commander assassinated here meant that strategy died with him. Intelligence gathered there prevented ambush that would have devastated Olympian forces. Supplies destroyed meant Titans fought hungry and poorly equipped. Morale undermined meant they began doubting victory, doubting each other, doubting whether resistance was worth continuing. Confidence eroded one invisible action at a time, one unexplained death at a time, one stolen secret at a time, until the Titans were fighting not just external enemy, but internal paranoia. They started suspecting each other of being traitors, since how else could Olympians know their plans so consistently? Alliances fractured, trust dissolved. The united front they'd maintained began cracking. When final battle came, when accumulated pressure finally broke Titan's ability to resist, when Zeus struck down Cronus atop Mount Othrys in combat that would be sung about for millennia, Hades was there, invisible, watching from shadows with his helm firmly in place, ensuring no one interfered, ready to strike if Zeus needed help, though Zeus didn't. This was Zeus's moment, the climax of the war, the act that would establish him as king. Hades understood that and stayed in shadows where he belonged. He saw their father fall, saw Titan King brought low by youngest son, saw the fear in Cronus's eyes as he realized he'd become what he'd tried to prevent, the overthrown parent, the failed king. And Hades felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of revenge fulfilled. no pleasure in seeing the being who'd swallowed him at birth finally defeated. Just quiet acknowledgement that this chapter had ended and another was beginning. The defeated Titans were cast into Tartarus, that pit Hades had visited when Zeus freed the Cyclopes, that deep darkness beneath even Underworld where the worst beings were imprisoned. Cronus and his allies would be locked behind gates of adamantine, guarded by the Hecatoncheires, with their 100 hands and 50 heads, trapped in darkness for eternity. It was fitting punishment, perfect irony. Cronus, who'd imprisoned his children in his body, would be imprisoned in Earth's body forever. Hades understood that fate viscerally in ways his siblings couldn't. He knew what imprisonment felt like, knew weight of darkness and slow grinding of trapped time, knew how captivity changed you, shaped you, made you into something different from what you'd been before confinement. He didn't pity Titans exactly, because they'd made their choices and consequences were deserved. But he understood their future in ways that made him quiet when others celebrated victory. With war ended and enemies defeated, 3 brothers faced question that determines everything after revolution. How do you divide world you've won? They'd overthrown Titans together, fought side by side for 10 years, earned freedom through combined effort and shared sacrifice. But now, they needed to establish new order, decide who ruled what, create structure that would last for millennia or longer. They chose to cast lots, which seemed fair at the time, which was meant to prevent arguments and establish equal claim to ruling. 3 realms to divide, 3 brothers to rule them, random chance determining who got what. The sky, vast and visible and glorious, from which you could look down on everything else. The sea, powerful and hidden and vital, supporting life but separate from most of it. And the underworld, realm of dead, necessary but grim, dark and silent and lonely beyond measure. Zeus drew the sky, the realm everyone wanted, the domain that came with Mount Olympus and automatic leadership position among gods, kingdom that was literally on top of everything else, both geographically and metaphorically. It was victory's prize, the best lot, the one that meant power visible to all, glory celebrated by mortals, position envied by every god. Poseidon drew the sea, vast in own way, powerful and vital, connected to mortal world through every coastline and harbor and ship that sailed. It wasn't the sky, but it was still magnificent realm, still powerful position, still something worth ruling. The sea was dangerous and beautiful and necessary, and Poseidon would make it his own in ways that would be remembered forever. And Hades drew the underworld, the shortest straw, the worst lot, the realm nobody wanted, that even most gods would learn to avoid visiting, where nothing grew and nothing changed, and every single inhabitant was there because they died. A kingdom of shadows and silence, of grief and finality, of endings that never ended because they simply persisted forever without change or hope of change. It was the realm that came with no glory, no celebration, no temples full of grateful worshippers making offerings and singing praises. Just fear, avoidance, and certain knowledge that he would be necessary but never loved, essential but never celebrated, doing the most important work in cosmos, but receiving least acknowledgement for it. Hades stood there with lot revealed, fate determined by chance that might not have been chance at all, with future laid out before him as king of realm he'd never seen, but already understood would be as dark and isolated as his childhood imprisonment. Only this time, imprisonment would be voluntary. He could refuse, could demand they draw again, could argue the lots were unfair or that he deserved better after fighting so hard for victory. His brothers might have listened, might have agreed to different arrangement, But Hades didn't argue or complain or protest. He'd learned acceptance in Cronus's belly, learned that some things simply are, and fighting unchangeable circumstances wastes energy better spent adapting to them. He accepted the underworld the way he'd accepted being swallowed at birth, way he'd accepted imprisonment for however many years, way he'd learned to accept everything that couldn't be changed through force of will alone. He simply nodded, took his helm of darkness that had served him so well in war, and prepared to descend to his new kingdom. He didn't linger on Olympus to celebrate victory or claim share of spoils or make speeches about duty or unfairness of fate. He didn't try to renegotiate or suggest alternative arrangements. He just accepted what the lots had given him and prepared to make the best of it, because that's what he did, because that's what he'd always done. But before he descended, he made one request, one condition for his acceptance of this fate. He wanted to keep the helm of darkness. It had been crucial in war, had made him invaluable to victory, had taught him how to use invisibility as both weapon and shield. And where he was going, to realm of shadows where dead walked and living feared to tread, invisibility might be just as useful as it had been on battlefield. Maybe more so. The Cyclopes agreed immediately, almost as if they'd expected this request. The helm was his to keep, to use forever, to carry into whatever darkness waited below. It was his weapon, his tool, his way of moving through world unseen when he chose. In realm where he would be avoided and feared, where even gods would hesitate to visit, having ability to move invisibly might be only comfort available. With that agreement secured, with fate accepted and future determined, and his one request granted, Hades prepared to descend. He didn't say goodbye to his siblings, didn't make emotional farewells, or extract promises that they'd visit or stay in touch. He knew they wouldn't visit. Why would they? He wouldn't visit them either, not often. Their worlds were separating naturally. Zeus would rule from above, Poseidon from the deep, and Hades from below, and they'd see each other rarely, if at all. He just descended, walking down through earth itself, through layers of soil and rock and mineral, past roots of mountains and underground rivers and caverns where no light ever reached, down to where dead go, where souls congregated, where his kingdom waited. The earth closed above him as he descended, sealing him away from world of light, from sky and sun and stars, from everything bright and celebrated and loved. And Hades began his eternal reign in shadows, unseen by living, unvisited by gods, alone except for endless parade of souls who had no choice but to come to his realm because death, unlike lottery, was one draw everyone eventually made. No exceptions, no second chances, no escape. Just death, inevitable and final, and Hades waiting to receive them all. His brothers would visit Olympus constantly, live in palaces full of other gods, walk among mortals when they chose, see sunlight and stars and changing seasons. They would be celebrated and worshipped and loved, or at least feared in ways that came with respect. But Hades would remain in his underworld, maintaining order in realm of disorder, processing souls that never stopped coming, being death's administrator in cosmos that preferred to pretend death didn't exist. He'd drawn shortest straw and he'd accepted it, and he'd make it work because that's what he did. He endured, he accepted, he took worst circumstances and built something functional from them, something fair, something that would last forever, because death was forever, and someone had to make forever bearable for everyone who died. And so Hades descended to claim his throne, to build his kingdom, to begin work that would never end, in darkness that would never lighten, with loneliness that would never truly fade, no matter how many souls surrounded him. The god of death was taking up his position, and the world of living was already learning to avoid saying his name, as if silence could make death less real, as if not speaking of him could make them forget that everyone, eventually, would meet him face to face, drawing the shortest straw the moment the lots were revealed, the moment Hades saw that his destiny was the underworld while his brothers claimed sky and sea. Something shifted in the relationship between the three of them. Not immediately, not in any dramatic way that could be pointed to and analyzed, but gradually, inevitably, the way continental plates shift so slowly you don't notice until the earthquake hits and you realize everything has fundamentally changed. Zeus had won everything. That's what it felt like to Hades, watching his youngest brother process the realization that he'd drawn the sky, that he would rule from Mount Olympus, that he would be king of gods in every sense that mattered. Zeus would sit highest, both literally and metaphorically. He would be the one other gods came to with disputes. He would be the default leader simply by virtue of ruling the realm that was above all other realms. The sky looked down on everything. That meant Zeus looked down on everything. There was no malice in it, no conspiracy or cheating. The lots had been random, or as random as anything can be when gods are involved. But the result was that Zeus, already charismatic and confident and politically savvy, would have every natural advantage in establishing himself as supreme ruler. Height matters, even to gods, especially to gods. Poseidon had won something significant too. The sea was vast, powerful, vital to mortal civilization. Ships sailed on Poseidon's domain. Coastal cities depended on his mercy. Fish came from his realm. The sea was beautiful and terrible, capable of gentleness and catastrophic violence, and ruling it meant commanding respect even from Zeus. Poseidon wouldn't be king of gods, but he'd be king of a realm that touched every coastline, that connected continents, that made trade and travel and exploration possible. It was power visible and acknowledged. But Hades had drawn the underworld, and even in that first moment, even before descending, he understood what that meant. Not just that he'd rule the dead, though that was significant, but that he'd be separate, apart. The underworld wasn't on the surface of the world where Zeus and Poseidon's realms touched. It was beneath everything, literally underground, existing in spaces between spaces, in darkness below the light. He would be the forgotten brother. Not because his siblings would deliberately exclude him, but because his realm would exclude him. You can't rule the underworld and visit Olympus regularly. You can't manage the endless parade of dead souls and still attend divine parties. You can't be king of death and remain connected to world of life in any meaningful way. The earth was meant to be neutral ground, shared by all three brothers, neither owned nor ruled by any of them. But in practice, Zeus would walk it freely because sky was always above land. Poseidon would touch it through coastlines and rivers. But Hades would be beneath it, separated from surface world by layers of rock and soil, visiting only rarely, and only when he chose to travel up through darkness to reach light. In that moment of the lots being revealed, Hades could have objected, could have pointed out the unfairness, could have argued that the underworld was clearly the worst of the three realms, could have demanded they draw again, or find another solution. His brothers might have listened. They'd fought together for 10 years. They owed him that much at least. But Hades didn't object because objecting wouldn't change anything. The lots had been drawn. The realms needed rulers. Someone had to take the underworld, And if not him, then who? Zeus was clearly meant to be king, was already positioning himself as leader, had natural advantages that made any other arrangement feel wrong. Poseidon had the volatility and power that suited the sea perfectly, his temperament matching the waves, his strength matching the depths. And Hades? Hades had spent his entire existence learning to endure darkness, learning to accept circumstances he couldn't change, learning patience and silence and the ability to exist in isolation without breaking. He was, whether he wanted to be or not, perfectly suited to rule the underworld. The lots hadn't been random at all, or if they had, they'd been random in the way that cosmos sometimes is, where chance and destiny look identical from outside, but feel different from inside. So he accepted, not happily, not with enthusiasm, not with any joy at claiming his realm, but with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the war, with the understanding that someone had to do this job, and he was the one holding the marker that said it would be him. He accepted because that's what he did, what he'd always done, what he'd learned to do during those years or centuries trapped in his father's belly. His brothers noticed his acceptance, noticed that he didn't argue or complain or demand reconsideration. Zeus looked almost guilty for a moment, as if he knew he'd won and Hades had lost, and there was nothing fair about it, despite the random draw. Poseidon looked relieved that Hades wasn't going to fight for the sea, that there wouldn't be conflict between them over who ruled which realm, but neither offered to trade. Neither suggested they draw again. Neither proposed alternative arrangements that might be more equitable. They accepted Hades's acceptance, grateful that he was making this easy, that he wasn't going to create problems or demands or conflicts that would complicate the transition from war to peace. And Hades understood that too, understood that his willingness to accept the worst lot meant his brothers would let him, that they would take their good fortunes and feel vaguely grateful to him for not making trouble, but wouldn't actually do anything to help him or make his burden lighter. Because people, even gods, even brothers who'd fought together through 10 years of war, will generally accept whatever distribution of fortune you let them accept. If you complain, they might help. If you demand, they might negotiate. But if you accept quietly, they'll assume you're fine with it and move on to arranging their own lives. Hades accepted quietly, so Zeus and Poseidon moved on. Before he descended, Hades looked at the world one more time. The surface world where mortals lived and built and struggled and created civilizations that would rise and fall. The sky where Zeus would rule, where clouds drifted and birds flew, and the sun crossed from horizon to horizon. The sea where Poseidon would make his kingdom, where waves rolled endlessly and creatures swam in depths no mortal could reach. All of it was beautiful. All of it was full of life and movement and change. All of it was somewhere he would rarely visit, somewhere he would become strange and foreign, somewhere he would exist only as feared possibility rather than actual presence. He was looking at the world of the living, and he was about to spend eternity separate from it, managing what came after life ended, dealing with the results rather than the process. He didn't linger on this observation, didn't let himself feel the full weight of what he was giving up, what he'd never really had chance to experience in the first place. He'd been born and immediately swallowed. He'd spent his childhood imprisoned. He'd spent 10 years at war. And now he would spend eternity underground. There would be no period of his existence where he simply lived, where he walked in sunlight without purpose or destination, where he experienced life rather than death. But that was fine. It had to be fine. Someone had to be god of death, and he was the one holding the marker. So he took his helm, verified he could keep it, and began his descent. The earth opened for him as he approached, recognizing its new master, acknowledging that he had right to pass through it, that he was going home even though he'd never seen his home before. He descended through layers of rock and soil, through underground rivers and caverns, through spaces where no light penetrated and no living thing dwelled. The earth closed above him as he went, sealing him in, protecting the surface world from the underworld, protecting the underworld from the surface world, creating boundary that would remain firm for eternity. And as he descended, Hades felt something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction or joy or any positive emotion, but a kind of recognition. This darkness, this isolation, this separation from everything bright and celebrated and loved felt familiar. It felt like Cronus's belly, like the imprisonment he'd already survived. It felt like coming back to something he knew, somewhere he understood how to exist. If he'd drawn the sky or the sea, he would have had to learn new ways of being, would have had to become someone different, someone more public, more visible, more engaged with life and mortals and celebration. But the underworld just required him to be what he already was, patient, accepting, capable of existing in darkness without breaking, able to do necessary work without needing acknowledgement or glory. He was going home to a home he'd never seen, and it felt right in the way that terrible things sometimes feel right when they're inevitable. He was the god of death, and he was descending to his kingdom, and the world above was already learning to forget he existed, except as something to fear and avoid. Zeus would rule from Olympus and be celebrated as king. Poseidon would rule from the depths and be feared as the power that could drown cities. But Hades would rule from below and be simply necessary, the inevitable end that everyone reached but nobody wanted to think about until they had no choice. The shortest straw had been drawn, and Hades had accepted it. And now he was descending into darkness one final time. Except this time, it was his darkness, his kingdom, his responsibility to bear forever. And he would bear it because that's what he did, because he was Hades, and endurance was his gift, or his curse, or perhaps both at once, and someone had to be god of death. The earth closed completely above him, and he was alone in darkness again, just like childhood, just like imprisonment, just like he'd always been in some essential way. Except this time, the darkness was his to command, and the aloneness was a choice he'd made by accepting the lot. And the work that awaited him was work that would never end, but would also never change, which was its own kind of comfort. Hades had drawn the shortest straw, and he would make it work, and he would rule his kingdom fairly and well, and he would endure forever, because enduring was what he did best, and the world above would forget him except as something to fear, and his brothers would rarely visit, and he would be alone in darkness, managing death for eternity. And that was fine. It had to be fine, because someone had to do it, and he was the one holding the marker, and he'd never been one to shirk necessary work just because it was unpleasant or thankless or eternal. He was Hades, god of the underworld, king of the dead, and his reign was just beginning. The abduction of Persephone. When loneliness became desperation, time passed strangely in the underworld. Years could feel like days when you're immortal and doing the same work endlessly, processing souls that never stopped arriving, maintaining order that never changed, existing in darkness that never lightened. Or days could feel like years when you're utterly alone, surrounded by ghosts who can't really talk to you because they're too busy processing their own deaths, managing a kingdom that never celebrates or laughs or experiences anything that might be called joy. Hades ruled the dead for what might have been centuries, doing his job faithfully and well, maintaining order with the patience he'd learned in his father's belly, judging souls fairly without favoritism, ensuring the dead stayed dead and the living stayed away. And through it all, he was lonely in ways that mere mortals can barely comprehend. Not lonely in the way mortals are lonely, missing specific people or specific experiences, yearning for a friend who moved away or a lover who left. Lonely in a fundamental, existential way. The loneliness of existing in a role that ensures isolation. The loneliness of being necessary but avoided, essential but feared, important but never celebrated. The loneliness of waking each day knowing that every single being in your kingdom is there because they died, that not one of them chose to be there, that you're surrounded by misery and grief and endings without any counterbalance of joy or beginning or continuation. The other gods rarely visited. Why would they? The underworld was cold, dark, depressing in ways that even divine cheerfulness couldn't overcome. Zeus stayed on Olympus, ruling the sky, throwing parties that lasted for days, having affairs with mortal women and nymphs and occasionally other goddesses, being celebrated and worshipped and adored by mortals who built him temples and made sacrifices and prayed for his favor. Zeus's life was full of people who wanted to be near him, who sought his company, who valued his presence. Poseidon lived in his ocean palace, married to Amphitrite, fathering children who swam through the depths, making sailors pray to him with hope rather than dread. Poseidon's realm was vast and full of life, creatures that moved and hunted and bred, currents that flowed and changed, tides that responded to the moon, connection to the world of the living through every coastline and harbor and ship that sailed. Poseidon was part of life's cycle, essential to it, celebrated by those whose lives depended on the sea's mercy. Even Hestia, goddess of the hearth, quiet and withdrawn as she was, existed among life and warmth and families. She lived in every home fire, was present at every meal, was acknowledged every time someone cooked food or gathered around a hearth for warmth. She was solitary by choice, but she was solitary among the living, surrounded by the warmth of human existence, even if she didn't directly interact with it. But Hades existed among the dead. His subjects were ghosts, transparent and quiet, incapable of genuine conversation because they were too busy processing their own mortality to engage with him as a person, too wrapped up in their own grief and confusion and loss, to provide him with any kind of companionship. His servants, the few living or semi-living beings in his realm like Charon and the judges, kept respectful distance. They did their jobs efficiently, but didn't chat, didn't joke, didn't provide the casual connection that makes existence bearable. Cerberus was loyal, but not conversant. You can pet a dog, even a 3-headed dog the size of a house, but you can't talk to it about the crushing weight of eternity or the frustration of being avoided by everyone who matters to you. The judges were dutiful, but not friendly. They processed souls and reported problems, but they didn't sit with Hades over wine and discuss philosophy, or share stories, or provide the kind of companionship that gods supposedly enjoyed on Olympus. Hades sat on his throne and managed his kingdom, and understood with increasing clarity that this was his existence forever. Power without companionship, authority without affection, purpose without pleasure, an eternity of necessary work done in complete isolation, acknowledged only through fear and avoidance, celebrated never. He visited the surface occasionally, making rare journeys up through the earth to see what living looked like, to remind himself that existence wasn't always gray and silent and sad. He would wear his helm of darkness, invisible to mortals and gods alike, and simply observe. Watch families gather for meals, parents and children, and grandparents sharing food and conversation and laughter. See lovers meet and court, that dance of attraction and uncertainty and eventual connection. Observe festivals and celebrations, people coming together to mark harvests or victories, or simply the joy of being alive. All the messy, complicated, beautiful chaos of life that he supervised the end of but never participated in himself. He was death, always death, only death. He managed endings but never experienced beginnings. He processed losses but never had gains. He was the god of finality in a cosmos where everyone else got to experience continuation. During one of these visits, probably more than a century into his reign, though time was difficult to track when you were immortal, he saw her. Persephone, daughter of Demeter and Zeus. She was young for a goddess, probably only a few decades old in divine terms, still carrying that innocent assumption that happiness was natural and permanent, that beauty and joy were default states rather than temporary conditions. She was in a meadow in Sicily, gathering flowers with nymphs who attended her, laughing in the sunlight with a joy so pure it almost hurt to witness. She was bright where he was dark, full of life and energy, and that untouched quality of someone who'd never experienced loss or grief, or the crushing weight of responsibility. She represented everything Hades wasn't, everything he'd never been, everything his role prevented him from becoming. Light to his darkness, joy to his solemnity, life to his death, spring and growth and flowers and laughter and uncomplicated happiness. She was gathering narcissus blooms, bending to pluck them from the earth, the spring sun making her hair shine, her voice carrying across the meadow as she called to her companions, everything about her radiating the kind of simple pleasure in existence that Hades had never once experienced. And he wanted her with an intensity that surprised and frightened him, that felt like something breaking open inside him after centuries of being closed and controlled and patient. Not in the casual way Zeus wanted women, collecting lovers like mortals collect seashells, forgetting them as soon as the affair ended. Hades didn't work that way. He didn't have casual anything. Everything he did was with complete focus, total commitment, the same intensity he brought to ruling the underworld. He wanted Persephone with the desperation of someone who'd been alone too long, who'd accepted loneliness but never stopped hating it, who saw a possibility of companionship and couldn't let it go. He wanted her in his palace, in his kingdom, in his life. He wanted someone to talk to who wasn't a ghost or a servant. He wanted someone to share the burden of ruling the dead, someone to make the darkness less oppressive, someone to remind him that he was a person and not just a function. But he also knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from perfect understanding of reality, that she would never choose him. Why would she? He was the god of death. He lived in darkness and ruled the dead and managed a kingdom full of grief and endings. If he approached her like a normal suitor, if he courted her properly, if he asked her to visit the underworld and consider becoming his queen, she would refuse. Of course she would refuse. Anyone would refuse. No one chooses death over life. No one chooses darkness over light. No one chooses an eternity in the underworld over an eternity in sunlit meadows, gathering flowers and laughing with friends. It would be insane to choose him when she could choose literally anyone else, when she was beautiful and young and the daughter of two powerful gods. when she could have suitors who offered warmth and celebration and life instead of cold and isolation and death. So Hades did something that would define him forever in mortals' minds, something that would make him a villain in every telling of this story, something that would overshadow everything good he'd ever done or would do. He decided to take what he wanted rather than ask for it, because asking meant being refused, and he couldn't bear being refused, couldn't accept returning to his lonely kingdom after experiencing hope that things might be different. And because gods, even reluctant gods, even patient gods, even gods who usually followed rules, don't do things halfway when they finally decide to act, Hades made plans. First he went to Zeus, his brother, king of the gods, Persephone's father, not to ask permission exactly, because Zeus wasn't actually king of Hades' realm, had no authority over what happened in the underworld, but to inform him, to see if Zeus would object, to give his brother a chance to stop him if stopping was going to happen. It was the minimum courtesy, the bare acknowledgement that Persephone belonged to someone else before she could belong to Hades. Zeus, distracted by whatever affair he was currently conducting with whatever mortal or nymph had caught his attention that week, barely paid attention to Hades' carefully worded explanation. A daughter he barely acknowledged, taken by a brother who rarely asked for anything? Zeus shrugged, essentially. Do what you want. Persephone was his daughter, but Zeus had so many children he'd lost count. What was one less in the world above? What did it matter if Hades wanted to marry her, if that would make his lonely brother happy? Zeus didn't think about Demeter's feelings, didn't consider that a mother might object to her daughter being dragged to the underworld, didn't think through the implications of taking a goddess of spring and growth and life and trapping her in a realm of death. He just gave his casual consent, the equivalent of shrugging and saying, sure, whatever, and went back to his own concerns. Demeter, Persephone's mother, wasn't consulted. Hades knew she would never agree, that any conversation with her would end in absolute refusal. Demeter loved her daughter with the fierce, protective intensity that goddesses of fertility bring to motherhood, that connection to growth and nurture and continuation of life. She would fight to keep Persephone in the light, growing things, surrounded by life and beauty and everything opposite to death. So Hades didn't tell her. He planned his abduction knowing he was about to make an enemy of one of the most powerful goddesses in existence, knowing that Demeter would hate him forever, knowing that this action would have consequences that might reshape the entire world. And he decided that having Persephone, having companionship, having someone to share his darkness with, was worth it, worth any consequence, worth any cost, worth any amount of divine anger or mortal suffering that might result. On the chosen day, Persephone was in that same meadow again, gathering flowers with her nymphs. Hades had arranged for special flowers to grow there, narcissus blooms so beautiful that Persephone couldn't resist them, so perfect that she moved away from her companions to examine them more closely. She reached for the most perfect specimen, bending to pluck it from the earth, her attention completely focused on the flower's beauty. And the earth, responding to its true master, responding to the god who ruled everything beneath its surface, opened. Hades rose from the chasm in his chariot, pulled by black horses that had never seen sunlight, that knew only the darkness of the underworld, that moved with the speed of shadows fleeing light. He was terrifying in that moment, this dark god emerging from the earth like a nightmare made manifest, like death itself come to claim the living, like everything frightening about mortality given form and purpose. He grabbed Persephone before she could scream, before she could run, before she could do anything except drop the flower she'd been holding. His grip was iron, unyielding, the strength of someone who'd decided this was happening and wouldn't be stopped by resistance or protest or the rights of the person being taken. He pulled her into the chariot, and the earth began closing above them even as she found her voice and started screaming. She fought him. Of course she fought him. She wasn't some passive victim accepting her fate. She screamed and struggled and called for help, called for her mother, called for Zeus, called for anyone who might hear and rescue her. Her nymphs heard something, heard the earth moving and Persephone's scream cutting off. But by the time they reached where she'd been, there was nothing. Just dropped flowers and disturbed earth, and the fading sound of something that might have been her voice coming from underground. Hades held her as they descended, held her with the strength of someone who'd been alone for centuries and had finally found someone to share his isolation with, even if that someone was fighting him with every bit of strength she had. She scratched at his arms, tried to pull away, screamed until her voice went raw, but none of it made any difference. They were descending through the earth, through layers of rock and soil and roots, down past where light penetrated, down to where the rivers flowed and Cerberus waited, and the dead wandered in gray fields. The descent wasn't long, couldn't be long, because Hades wanted it over with, wanted them past the point where she might somehow escape, wanted them in his palace where he could try to explain, try to make her understand, try to begin whatever conversation might eventually lead to her accepting this new reality. The earth closed completely above them, sealing them in darkness, cutting off any possibility of rescue or escape. They arrived in his palace, and Hades finally set her down, finally released his grip on her. She immediately tried to run, looking for exits, for ways out, for any possibility of escape. But there was no escaping the underworld. That was the entire point of its design, the fundamental rule Hades had built into every aspect of his kingdom. The dead couldn't leave. And as far as the underworld was concerned, as far as its rivers and gates and cosmic laws understood, Persephone was now one of its residents, trapped like every soul that had ever died, except she was still alive, still aware, still desperately wanting to return to the light and the flowers and her mother and everything she'd known before this moment. She was alive in a realm of death, warm in a place of eternal cold, growing and vital in a kingdom of endings and stagnation. Hades tried to explain, tried to make her understand. He told her he'd been alone for so long, that he'd seen her and felt something he'd never felt before, that he wanted her as his queen, that he could give her power and respect and a kingdom to rule beside, to him, that she would be worshipped as queen of the dead, that souls would pray to her for mercy, that she would have authority equal to his own over the entire underworld. She didn't want to hear it. She alternated between screaming at him in rage and refusing to speak to him at all in cold silence. She wouldn't eat the food his servants brought, wouldn't drink wine offered to comfort her, wouldn't sleep in the bed prepared for her. She just stood in his palace, this living goddess in a realm of death, and grieved for everything she'd lost with an intensity that made even the dead pause in their wandering to listen. She was miserable, and Hades had made her miserable, and there was no way to fix it except sending her back. And he couldn't send her back, not yet, not before she'd at least given him a chance, not before she'd seen that the underworld wasn't evil, that he wasn't evil, that they could rule together, and perhaps she might find purpose here, even if she never found happiness. Above ground, Demeter had noticed her daughter's absence. When Persephone didn't return from the meadow, when the nymphs reported hearing something strange, and then finding only scattered flowers, when there was no trace of her daughter anywhere in Sicily or anywhere else she looked, Demeter knew something terrible had happened. She searched everywhere, asked every god and nymph and mortal who might have seen something. No one knew. Or rather, no one was willing to tell her that Zeus had essentially approved Persephone's abduction by his own brother, that the king of the gods had casually consented to his daughter being dragged to the underworld, that there had been no violence or kidnapping in the traditional sense, but rather a planned taking with divine permission. Demeter's grief transformed into something else. Rage, yes, hot and immediate and powerful, but also a kind of desperate depression that affected everything she touched. As goddess of the harvest, Demeter's mood directly impacted the earth's fertility. Her emotional state determined whether crops grew, whether seasons progressed, whether the earth produced food for mortals and gods alike. When she grieved, crops failed. When she raged, nothing grew. When she abandoned her duties entirely, too consumed by finding her daughter to care about her responsibilities to mortals, the world began to die. It was slow at first, easy to dismiss as bad weather or poor soil or normal variation in harvest quality. Crops grew slower than usual, produced less than expected. Farmers worked harder for smaller yields. But then things got worse. Fields that should have been ready for harvest stood brown and dead. Seeds planted with proper technique simply didn't sprout. Trees stopped fruiting entirely. Gardens withered no matter how carefully they were tended. Animals began to starve because plants weren't growing for them to eat. Humans began to starve because their farms produced nothing, because trade routes couldn't move. Food that didn't exist, because even the richest storehouses eventually ran empty when no new harvest came. It wasn't winter, which was natural and planned and part of the cycle of seasons. This was something else. This was death spreading across the earth because the goddess of life had stopped caring about life. This was Demeter's grief, made manifest in dying crops and starving mortals and earth that refused to produce anything at all. This was what happened when you took someone's child without permission and expected there to be no consequences. This was the price of Hades's loneliness, Persephone's imprisonment, Zeus's casual consent. The world was dying, and the gods finally noticed, and Zeus finally realized that maybe his casual shrug about Hades taking Persephone might have been a mistake. Maybe mothers whose children are stolen don't just accept it and move on. Maybe goddesses whose daughters are dragged to the underworld might object strongly enough to let the entire world starve. Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with a command disguised as a request. Release Persephone. Return her to her mother. Undo what you've done before every mortal dies, and we have no one left to worship us. The gods needed mortals' sacrifices and prayers. Mortals were dying. The math was simple even for Zeus. Hades received Hermes in his throne room, with Persephone standing beside him but as far from him as she could get while still being technically beside him. She looked terrible, thinner, paler, more ghost-like than goddess-like. She hadn't eaten since arriving, hadn't drunk anything except small sips of water, had existed in his palace like a prisoner, which was exactly what she was. Hermes delivered Zeus's message, and Hades understood that his time with Persephone, such as it was, had ended. He'd wanted companionship and instead had created a prisoner. He'd wanted to not be lonely, and instead had made himself into exactly the kind of villain everyone already feared he was. He'd taken something that didn't belong to him, and the consequences were unfolding across the entire world. But there was a complication, a cosmic law. that even Hades as king of the underworld couldn't simply ignore. Anyone who ate the food of the dead became bound to the underworld. It was fundamental rule, older than Hades, embedded in the fabric of reality itself. Eat in the land of the dead, and you become, in some sense, one of the dead. You can't fully leave. You're tied to that realm forever. And Persephone, in all her time in the underworld, during all those days or weeks of refusing food, of starving herself rather than accept anything from Hades, had at some point eaten something. Pomegranate seeds. Just a few. 6 of them, or perhaps 3, or perhaps 7, depending on which version of the story you believe. The exact number would determine the terms of the compromise, but what mattered was that she'd eaten them. She'd consumed food from the underworld. She was bound to it now, at least partially, forever. And that changed everything about how this situation could be resolved, because cosmic laws don't bend just because gods want them to, and even Zeus couldn't completely overrule the fundamental binding of someone who'd eaten in the land of death. Due to length constraints, the script continues with the remaining planned sections. Current word count is approaching 15,000 words. Would you like me to continue adding the final sections, or would you like to review what's been created so far? And the gates and the rivers flowing eternally, and the judges working ceaselessly, and the souls arriving constantly. Hades understood that he would be lonely forever, and he accepted this too, because acceptance was what he did, because endurance was his gift, or his curse, or perhaps both at once, because someone had to be god of death, and he was the one holding the shortest straw. The kingdom of the dead was built, organized, functional. Justice would be served. The dead would be managed fairly. Death would make sense, would have structure, would provide appropriate rewards and punishments. And Hades would maintain it all, forever, alone in darkness, doing the most necessary work in the cosmos, while receiving the least acknowledgement for it. And that was fine. It had to be fine. Because someone had to do it, and he was the one who'd drawn that lot, and he'd never been one to shirk necessary work just because it was unpleasant or thankless or eternal. He was Hades, god of the underworld, king of the dead, and his eternal reign had begun. Persephone, from captive to Queen Hades, could have kept Persephone based on the technicality of the pomegranate seeds. Could have told Hermes, told Zeus, told Demeter that Persephone belonged to the underworld now, that she'd eaten food of the dead, and that meant she couldn't leave. That cosmic law superseded any command from Zeus or any mother's grief. He could have used the rules to keep her imprisoned, to force her to stay, to maintain his companionship through legal technicality, even though she hated him, even though keeping her meant the world above would continue dying. He didn't. Because even Hades, lonely as he was, desperate as he'd been, wasn't enough of a villain to keep someone who wanted to leave based purely on a technicality they didn't understand when they violated it. He'd made a terrible mistake in taking her, had learned that lesson through her misery and the world's suffering. He wouldn't compound that mistake by keeping her through cosmic loopholes, so he agreed to a compromise. Persephone would return to the world above, to her mother, to light and life and flowers and everything she'd been stolen from. But because she'd eaten in the underworld, because cosmic law was absolute and even gods couldn't completely ignore it, she would have to return for part of each year. The exact amount of time depended on how many seeds she'd eaten. 6 months, perhaps, or 4, or 3. The myths disagreed on the details, but the principle was clear. Details were negotiated by Zeus and Demeter and Hades, with Persephone having remarkably little say in her own fate, which was typical for how Greek mythology treated women, but particularly cruel. given that she was the one whose life was being divided. But the end result was established. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother in the world above, bringing spring and growth and life, and part of the year with Hades in the underworld, during which time Demeter would grieve and the world would experience winter and death and dormancy. This is how the Greeks explained seasons, why crops grow in spring and summer but die in fall and winter, why the earth is fertile and then barren, alive and then dormant, green and then gray. Because a goddess of spring spends part of her time trapped in the underworld, and her mother grieves so deeply that nothing grows, and everyone suffers because one god was lonely enough to kidnap the wrong person and set in motion consequences that would echo forever. Persephone left that first time with relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. She practically ran toward the surface, toward sunlight, toward her mother waiting above. Demeter held her daughter and wept, and then slowly, gradually, joyfully allowed things to grow again. Spring returned with an intensity that made up for its absence. Crops flourished beyond expectation. Flowers bloomed in impossible profusion. The world breathed again after being suffocated by death and grief. And Hades was alone again in his dark palace, except now his loneliness was complicated by guilt and the knowledge that when Persephone returned, as cosmic law required she must, she would hate him for what he'd done. He'd wanted companionship, and instead had created an enemy, a prisoner, someone who would spend part of her time in his realm, resenting every moment of it. He sat on his throne and waited for her return, because waiting was what he did, because endurance was his nature, because he'd made his choice, and now had to live with its consequences forever. The underworld felt emptier after she left than it had before she arrived, which seemed impossible, but was true. Before Persephone, he'd been alone but hadn't known what he was missing. After Persephone, he knew exactly what absence felt like, could measure the emptiness against the brief presence of someone living and vital in his realm of death. When she returned that first time, when cosmic law pulled her back down to the underworld, when she arrived in his palace no longer fighting, but moving with grim acceptance, the tension between them was almost unbearable. She was angry still, resentful certainly, but also resigned. She understood now that this was her fate, that she would spend part of every year in this dark place, that fighting it accomplished nothing because cosmic law was absolute. Hades tried to apologize, tried to explain that he'd been wrong, that loneliness had driven him to desperation, that if he could undo what he'd done, he would. She listened in cold silence, neither accepting the apology nor rejecting it, just existing in the same space as him, with walls up that seemed impossible to breach. Those first returns must have been terrible for both of them. Persephone arrived angry, grieving the light she'd just left, resentful of every moment she had to spend in darkness. She counted days until she could leave, marked time with the desperation of a prisoner awaiting release. Hades received her awkwardly, uncertain how to treat someone who was technically his wife, but actually his prisoner, who ruled beside him in title, but hated him in practice. They existed in the same palace like two magnets with the same polarity, unable to come together without repulsion. They spoke only when necessary about underworld business. They avoided each other when possible. They maintained careful distance, careful politeness, careful avoidance of any topic that might reference how she'd arrived or why she was required to stay. But something strange happened over time, over years, over decades, over centuries of forced cohabitation. Persephone changed, and Hades changed, and their relationship evolved into something neither expected, something that wasn't exactly love, but wasn't exactly hate either. Something complicated and strange, and perhaps only possible between immortals with literally eternity to work through their issues. Persephone began to understand the underworld. At first, she'd seen it only as prison, dark place full of death and suffering and endings. But as she spent more time there, as she watched Hades work, as she saw how he managed the dead with fairness and patience, as she observed the care he took to ensure justice was served and souls were treated according to how they'd lived, she started to see differently. The underworld wasn't evil, it was necessary. Death wasn't cruel, it was inevitable. And Hades wasn't a villain, or at least not only a villain. He was someone who'd made a terrible decision out of desperation. Yes, but he was also someone who took his responsibilities seriously, who tried to make death as fair and bearable as possible, who carried an enormous burden without complaint day after day for eternity. She started to take on duties in the underworld, not because Hades forced her, but because existing there without purpose was harder than existing with it, because having nothing to do except count days until she could leave made time move impossibly slowly. She would greet newly dead souls as they arrived, welcome them to the realm they'd entered, explain what came next in a gentler voice than Hades or the judges used. She was better at comfort than Hades was. She'd been alive more recently, remembered more clearly what it felt like to be mortal, understood the fear and confusion of death more immediately because she'd experienced something like death herself when she'd been torn from the world above. Souls responded to her in ways they didn't respond to Hades. They were drawn to her warmth in this cold place, sought her presence when they were confused or frightened, or struggling to accept what had happened to them. She became, gradually, and perhaps without fully intending to, actually queen of the underworld. Not just in title, but in function. She had opinions about how things should be run, about which punishments were too severe, about whether certain souls deserved Elysium or just the Asphodel Meadows. And Hades, surprised to have someone who actually talked to him about something other than logistics, someone who engaged with the work rather than just enduring the time, listened to those opinions. They had conversations, real conversations, not just cold exchanges about schedule and duty and when she would be required to return, about mortality and immortality, about justice and mercy, about the nature of death and what came after, about whether suffering in Tartarus ever became redemption, whether souls in the Asphodel Meadows were better off than they'd been in difficult lives, whether Elysium was reward enough for virtue. Hades, who'd been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten how to have conversations, discovered he actually enjoyed talking to someone who wasn't a servant or supplicant, someone who challenged his thinking, who had different perspectives, who made him consider whether the way he'd always done things was the best way or just the familiar way. Persephone, who'd hated him so completely and so justly, discovered he was more complex than she'd thought, more thoughtful, more burdened by his role, more aware of the weight of his decisions, more capable of admitting mistakes, of accepting criticism, of changing his mind when presented with good arguments. He wasn't the simple villain she'd first believed, the selfish god who'd stolen her without thought for consequences. He was complicated, damaged, doing his best with an impossible job in circumstances that would break most beings. He never apologized for the abduction. Not really. There was no apology adequate for kidnapping someone and forcing them into marriage. No words that could make that action acceptable. But he acknowledged in their conversations that he'd been wrong. That desperation didn't justify what he'd done. That if he could go back, he would do it differently, would try to court her properly, even though he knew she would have refused, would accept that refusal rather than take what he wanted. It wasn't apology, but it was honesty. And honesty meant something in a relationship that had started with deception and force. It was a foundation, perhaps, that something better could be built on, given enough time and effort and willingness to try. Persephone never forgave him for the abduction. That's important to understand. Forgiveness suggests that the wrong is erased, that the harm is undone, that things return to what they were before. But you can't erase being kidnapped. You can't undo being forced into a marriage you never wanted. You can't return to innocence once you've experienced that kind of violation. But she stopped actively hating him, stopped seeing him as enemy, and started seeing him as complicated person who'd made terrible mistake. Started appreciating his fairness, his patience, his genuine attempts to make the underworld as bearable as possible, not just for her, but for every soul that arrived. Started to see the lonely God beneath the dark exterior, the one who'd been imprisoned by his father, and then imprisoned by his role, and then imprisoned by his own terrible decision. They became partners in ruling the underworld, if not quite partners in marriage. They shared responsibilities, made decisions together, presented united front to souls and gods who visited. When Persephone was in the underworld, she was truly its queen, and Hades treated her as such, respecting her judgments even when they differed from his own, deferring to her in matters where she had more insight or compassion than he did. She brought changes to the underworld, small ones at first, then more significant. She softened some of the harsher punishments in Tartarus, arguing that eternal suffering might be excessive for finite crimes. She added small comforts to the asphodel meadows, things that made the gray existence slightly less bleak. She spent time in Elysium making it more beautiful, adding flowers that shouldn't be able to grow in the underworld, but did, because she was goddess of spring and growth-bent rules when she touched them. Hades allowed all of this, even encouraged it. The underworld was better with her in it, not just for him, but for the souls who dwelled there. She brought perspective he lacked, compassion that balanced his justice, mercy that complemented his fairness. They became effective co-rulers, each bringing different strengths to the work of managing death. But there was still something missing between them personally. Love, perhaps, or at least the kind of passionate love that other gods experienced, the love that Zeus and Hera fought with, that Aphrodite inspired in others, that poets sang about and mortals died for. What Hades and Persephone had was quieter, more complicated, built on shared experience and mutual respect rather than desire or romance. They existed together, ruled together, talked together, but they didn't really love each other, not in those early centuries. Maybe they couldn't love each other, not with that foundation of abduction and imprisonment and forced cohabitation. Maybe genuine love requires choice, and neither of them had really chosen this situation. Hades had taken her without consent. She was required by cosmic law to return. There was no choice in any of it. But they cared for each other. That much became clear over time. Hades cared whether Persephone was happy or miserable, whether she found purpose in the underworld or just endured it, whether she hated every moment or had learned to find value in the work they did together. He tried to make her time in the underworld better, not through grand gestures, but through small considerations, through respecting her opinions and valuing her contributions, and acknowledging that she made everything better just by being there. Persephone cared whether Hades suffered from loneliness when she left, whether he appreciated her presence or just tolerated it, whether their conversations meant something to him or were just filling time until she could leave. She found herself thinking about him when she was in the world above, wondering how he was managing without her, feeling something that might have been concern or might have been just habit born of spending so much time together. They developed routines, comfortable patterns of coexistence. They would walk through the underworld together, discussing souls or philosophy or nothing at all. They would sit in companionable silence, both understanding that sometimes the best company is someone who doesn't demand constant conversation. They learned each other's moods, each other's preferences, each other's ways of processing stress and grief, and the endless weight of managing death. She started calling him by his name rather than titles. He started consulting her on major decisions rather than just informing her of them. They became, in a strange way, a unit, separate for part of the year when she returned to her mother and the world above, together for the rest, but always connected by bonds that had started as imprisonment and become something else. Hades remained faithful to Persephone, mostly. He had few affairs, far fewer than his brothers, far fewer than most male gods who seemed to collect lovers like achievements to boast about. There was Minthe, a nymph who lived in the underworld, who caught his attention either before Persephone arrived or during one of her absences, depending on which version of the story you believe. When Persephone discovered the affair, she reacted with the same jealous rage that characterized most Greek goddesses. She turned Minthe into a mint plant, transforming her rival into something useful but silent, something that would serve rather than compete. Hades didn't object to the transformation, accepted it as justified, didn't pursue Minthe in her new form, or try to undo what Persephone had done. There was Luce, another nymph, whom Hades had reportedly loved before Persephone. When Luce died, as even nymphs eventually did, Hades turned her into a white poplar tree in Elysium, honoring her memory. Persephone allowed this, understanding that Hades had existed before their forced marriage, that he'd had feelings and relationships that predated her, that his life hadn't begun when he'd abducted her. But compared to Zeus's endless affairs with mortal women and nymphs and goddesses, compared to Poseidon's countless children scattered across the Mediterranean, Hades was remarkably faithful, perhaps because he understood guilt better than his brothers, had learned through painful experience that taking what you wanted without consent had terrible consequences. Perhaps because Persephone, once she'd stopped actively hating him, was actually enough companionship for someone who'd been alone so long. Perhaps because he'd finally gotten what he wanted and wasn't foolish enough to risk it through casual affairs. They had no children together, Hades and Persephone. The sources disagree about whether this was choice or circumstance, whether gods of death and spring could even produce life, whether they tried and failed or never tried at all. Some later traditions gave them children: Melinoa, goddess of ghosts, and Zagreus, who had complicated mythology of his own involving rebirth and mystery cults. But in the core Greek myths, they remained childless, this king and queen of the dead, who ruled over everyone's ancestors, but produced no descendants of their own. Perhaps it was fitting. Their relationship wasn't about creating new life. It was about managing death, about making the inevitable bearable, about finding companionship in the darkest places. Children would have changed the dynamic, would have tied them together in ways they weren't ready for, would have added complexity to a relationship already complicated enough. Or perhaps the underworld itself was their child, this kingdom they built together, this structure they maintained, this eternal work they shared. Over time, over immeasurable time measured in centuries rather than years, something softened between them. Persephone stopped counting days until she could leave, stopped marking time like a prisoner. She still left when the season came, still returned to her mother and the world above, still brought spring wherever she walked. But she also returned to the underworld without quite as much resentment, with something that might have been anticipation mixed in with the resignation. Hades stopped bracing for her anger every time she arrived, stopped treating her like she might shatter if he said the wrong thing. He relaxed around her, let her see more of who he actually was beneath the formal king of the dead persona he showed the rest of the world. They became comfortable with each other in ways that only come from spending enormous amounts of time together, from working through conflicts and finding resolutions, from building shared history. They developed inside jokes, references that meant something only to them. They had disagreements and learned to argue productively rather than destructively. They found balance between her optimism and his pessimism, her warmth and his cold, her life and his death. They became complementary rather than opposed, partners rather than captor and captive. Whether they ever truly loved each other remains a question the myths don't definitively answer. Perhaps they did in their way, in love born from shared burden rather than shared joy, from respect rather than passion, from choosing to stay when departure became emotionally possible rather than from never having choice to leave. Perhaps they didn't, but learned to care for each other anyway, because caring and loving aren't always the same thing, because deep affection can exist without romantic love, because partnership can be valuable without being passionate. What's certain is that Persephone became more than just Hades' queen. She became his partner, his counsel, his connection to the living world he'd left behind. And Hades became more than Persephone's captor. He became someone she respected, someone she worked alongside, someone whose loneliness she understood because she'd felt it too in those first years when she hated where she was and who had brought her there. They ruled the underworld together, the god who'd never wanted to be king and the goddess who'd never wanted to be queen. And they made it work because they had eternity to figure it out, because they were both too stubborn to let it fail, because sometimes relationships that start worst end up meaning most. Their story isn't romantic in the traditional sense. It's not a fairy tale. It's more honest than that, more complicated, more real despite being about gods and death and cosmic law. It's about how people, even immortal people, can grow and change and adapt, about how the worst beginning doesn't determine the ending, about how abduction and imprisonment can somehow, impossibly, transform into partnership and mutual respect if you have enough time and enough determination to make something better from something terrible. And every year, when Persephone descended to the underworld, when spring gave way to fall and life gave way to dormancy, Hades waited for her in his dark palace, and she came not as prisoner, but as queen, returning to the kingdom she'd helped build, to the role she'd learned to accept and perhaps even value, to the partner she'd learned to understand. And they ruled together in darkness, and the dead were judged fairly, and the underworld functioned as it should. And somewhere in that cold realm, two gods who'd started as captor and captive had become something else entirely. The famous visitors, heroes in the realm of death. The underworld wasn't meant for the living to visit. That was fundamental to its design. essential to its purpose. The living belonged in the world above, in sunlight and air and the endless complications of mortal existence. The dead belonged below, in shadow and silence, and the simplified existence of souls who'd finished living. The boundary between these states was meant to be absolute, crossed in only one direction, maintained by rivers and Cerberus and cosmic law itself. But heroes, being heroes, didn't accept boundaries that applied to ordinary people. They were chosen by gods, blessed with extraordinary abilities, driven by quests that required them to accomplish the impossible. And sometimes the impossible meant descending into the underworld while still alive, facing Hades in his own realm, taking what they wanted or needed, and somehow escaping back to the world above. Hades received these visitors with mixed feelings. Part of him appreciated the audacity, the courage it took to enter the realm of death voluntarily. Part of him resented the intrusion, the violation of the boundary he'd established, the assumption that rules applying to everyone else didn't apply to heroes. But mostly, he just evaluated each situation individually, deciding whether to help or hinder based on the visitor's intentions and how they approached him. Orpheus came first, or at least Orpheus was the most famous of the living visitors, the one whose story would be told and retold for thousands of years. He was a musician, perhaps the greatest musician who ever lived, able to make stones weep and trees dance with his music. He could charm wild animals and tame savage beasts, could make rivers change course and mountains move, could do with a lyre what other heroes did with swords and strength. He came to the underworld for love. His wife Eurydice had died on their wedding day, bitten by a snake while fleeing unwanted advances from another man. She'd died young, died pointlessly, died before their life together had really begun. Orpheus couldn't accept this, refused to accept it. He would go to the underworld and bring her back, would use his music to convince Hades himself to release her, would accomplish what no one else had ever accomplished. He descended through a cave in Thrace, passing through darkness that would have driven most mortals mad, following paths that only the dead usually walked. He played his lyre as he went, and the music was so beautiful that even the souls in the underworld stopped their aimless wandering to listen. Even Cerberus, the three-headed guardian, didn't attack him. All three heads were charmed by the music, pacified by melodies that spoke of love and loss and determination. He reached Hades' throne room and stood before the king of the dead with nothing but his lyre and his grief. He didn't threaten or demand or try to trick his way into getting what he wanted. He just played music that expressed everything he felt for Eurydice, everything they'd lost, everything he hoped to regain, played melodies that made even the dead remember what it felt like to be alive, to love, to hope. Hades listened. Persephone, who happened to be in the underworld during this visit, listened beside him. The music affected them both in different ways. Hades, who'd abducted Persephone out of loneliness, who understood what it meant to want someone so desperately you'd violate cosmic law to have them, felt the music touch something he rarely acknowledged. Persephone, who'd been stolen herself, who remembered the pain of being separated from everything she loved, wept openly. When Orpheus finished playing, when the last notes faded into the eternal silence of the underworld, Hades made his decision. He would allow it. He would let Eurydice return to life with Orpheus, would bend the rules that were supposed to be absolute, would permit this one exception because the music had been that beautiful, and the love had been that genuine. But there were conditions. There always were conditions when gods granted impossible requests. Orpheus could lead Eurydice back to the world above, but he couldn't look at her during the journey. He had to trust that she followed him, had to believe without confirmation, had to walk from the underworld to sunlight without turning to verify she was there. If he looked back even once, she would be pulled back to the underworld forever. It was a test of trust, of faith, of the same kind of determination that had brought Orpheus to the underworld in the first place. And it should have been easy. Just walk forward, don't look back, bring your wife home. But Orpheus was human, and humans doubt, and trust is harder than courage when you can't see proof that you're right to trust. He made it almost to the surface, almost to sunlight, almost to success. But in the final moments, doubt overwhelmed him. What if Hades had tricked him? What if Eurydice wasn't actually following? What if he emerged into sunlight alone, having failed without knowing when the failure occurred? He turned to look, to confirm, to see her one more time. And she was there, right behind him, so close to escape, so near to life. Their eyes met for one moment that held everything they felt for each other, everything they'd lost, everything they would never have. Then she faded, pulled back to the underworld by the terms of the agreement Orpheus had violated, by the condition he hadn't been able to fulfill. Hades watched this tragedy unfold without intervention. The terms had been clear. The condition had been violated. Eurydice belonged to death now, permanently, no second chances. Orpheus was escorted back to the surface by Hermes, grief-stricken and alone, having failed at the last possible moment. He would spend the rest of his life mourning, would never love anyone else, would eventually be torn apart by Maenads in a death as tragic as his wife's. Some said Hades had been cruel to set such conditions, that the test was designed to fail, that no human could resist looking when doubt crept in. But others understood that Hades had already bent the rules more than he should have. Letting someone return from death violated the fundamental order of things. The condition ensured that only perfect trust, perfect faith, perfect love could accomplish the impossible. Orpheus had been close, but close wasn't enough when you were trying to undo death itself. Heracles came to the underworld for his final labor, the one designed to be impossible even for someone as strong as he was. Eurystheus, the king, who'd assigned the 12 labors as punishment for Heracles' crime of killing his own family in a rage induced by Hera, commanded him to bring back Cerberus, to capture the guardian of the underworld and drag him to the surface, to prove that even death itself couldn't stop the greatest hero of Greece. Heracles approached differently than Orpheus had. He didn't sneak in through caves or try to charm his way past guardians. He went to Eleusis and was initiated into the mysteries, learned the proper rites for approaching the underworld, prepared himself spiritually and ritually for what he was about to attempt. Then he descended through a formal entrance, announced and acknowledged, following proper procedure, even though he was attempting something improper. He met Hades in the throne room and stated his purpose directly. He needed to capture Cerberus and bring him to the surface. It was his final labor, the last task standing between him and freedom from his service. He wasn't there to trick or steal or violate the laws of the underworld. He was asking permission, showing respect, acknowledging Hades' authority, even while requesting something extraordinary. Hades considered this request carefully. Cerberus was his guardian, his loyal servant, the being that maintained the boundary between life and death. Letting him be taken, even temporarily, even by a hero with divine parentage and legitimate purpose, risked undermining the entire structure of the underworld. but refusing might provoke Heracles to try taking Cerberus by force, which would cause even more disruption. So Hades made an offer. Heracles could take Cerberus to the surface if he could subdue the great hound without using weapons. No club, no sword, no arrows, just strength against strength, his divine heritage against Cerberus's supernatural power. If Heracles succeeded, he could borrow Cerberus. If he failed, he would either die trying or leave without accomplishing his labor. Heracles agreed. He found Cerberus at the gates of the Underworld and grappled with the three-headed dog using only his hands and his incredible strength. It was brutal combat that would have killed any mortal man. Cerberus bit him multiple times, poisonous saliva from all three mouths mixing in wounds that would have been fatal to anyone else. But Heracles endured, squeezing Cerberus in a hold that gradually cut off the hound's air supply, forcing him into submission without killing or permanently harming him. Cerberus yielded. Heracles dragged him to the surface, showed him to Eurystheus, and completed his labor. The king, terrified of the three-headed monster, immediately ordered Heracles to take Cerberus back to the Underworld. Heracles returned the guardian to Hades, who received both hero and hound with something approaching respect. Heracles had followed the rules, had shown proper respect, had treated Cerberus well despite their combat. It was as honorable a violation of the Underworld's sanctity as was possible. Theseus and Pirithous attempted to visit the Underworld with less honor and suffered for it. They were friends, heroes both, but their quest was based on arrogance rather than necessity. Pirithous had decided he wanted to marry Persephone, goddess and queen of the Underworld, despite the minor detail that she was already married to Hades. He convinced Theseus to help him abduct her, returning the favor since Theseus had helped Pirithous abduct Helen of Troy previously. They descended to the Underworld with the intention of stealing Hades' wife, not asking permission, not offering anything in exchange, just planning to take her through force or trickery. It showed astounding disrespect, breathtaking arrogance, the kind of hubris that gods inevitably punished. Hades received them with cold courtesy. He invited them to sit, to rest from their journey, to accept his hospitality before discussing their purpose. They sat on chairs in his throne room and immediately became stuck. The chairs were the chairs of forgetfulness, designed to trap anyone who sat on them, holding them in place and gradually erasing their memories until they forgot who they were and why they'd come. Theseus and Pirithous would sit there for years. Eventually, Heracles, during his visit to capture Cerberus, would free Theseus as a favor, ripping him from the chair with such force that Theseus lost part of his flesh, which is why Athenians supposedly had such thin thighs. But Pirithous, who'd been the instigator, remained trapped. The earth shook when Heracles tried to free him, suggesting that Hades himself objected. Pirithous would remain in the chair of forgetfulness forever, punishment for trying to steal the wife of death itself. Odysseus came to the Underworld on advice from the witch Circe. He needed to consult the prophet Tiresias, who died but retained his gift of prophecy in death. Only Tiresias could tell Odysseus how to return home to Ithaca after 10 years of war, and now years of wandering cursed by Poseidon's anger. So Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world and performed rituals to open a temporary gateway to the dead. He didn't fully descend into the Underworld. He stood at the threshold, at the boundary between life and death, and called the spirits to him with blood sacrifice. The shades came, drawn by the blood of sheep Odysseus had killed, desperate for even a sip of the vital essence they'd lost in death. Tiresias came and drank and prophesied, telling Odysseus of trials ahead and how to survive them. Other shades came too. Odysseus's mother, who died while he was at war, grieving for a son she thought she'd never see again. She tried to embrace him, but her shade passed through his arms, insubstantial as smoke. Other heroes from the Trojan War, Achilles and Ajax and Agamemnon, came to speak with someone from the living world, to share their stories of glorious death. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, told Odysseus he'd rather be a slave on earth than king among the dead. It was the greatest repudiation of warrior culture ever spoken, the ultimate hero declaring that even inglorious life was better than glorious death. Hades didn't intervene in Odysseus's consultation. The hero had approached respectfully, had made proper offerings, hadn't tried to take anything that didn't belong to him. He let the shades speak with the living man and then returned to their wandering. Psyche came to the underworld on a quest given by Aphrodite, who was jealous of the mortal girl's beauty and wanted to destroy her through impossible tasks. The final task was to descend to the underworld and ask Persephone for a portion of her beauty in a box, to return it to Aphrodite without opening it. It was designed to fail, designed to trap Psyche in the underworld or kill her in the attempt. But Psyche was clever. She learned how to descend safely, what offerings to bring, how to pass Cerberus, what to say to Charon. She reached Persephone's throne and made her request politely. Persephone, perhaps remembering what it felt like to be a pawn in others' games, granted the request. She gave Psyche a sealed box containing beauty or sleep or something similar, depending on which version of the story you believe. Psyche made it back to the surface, but couldn't resist opening the box to see what divine beauty looked like, to take some for herself. When she opened it, she fell into supernatural sleep, completing Aphrodite's trap. But Eros, who loved Psyche despite his mother's objections, woke her and eventually convinced the gods to make her immortal. Hades's role in this story was minimal, just allowing passage and granting a reasonable request. But it showed how the underworld functioned as testing ground for heroes, place where mortals could prove worth through proper respect and procedure. These visitors showed Hades that boundaries, no matter how carefully maintained, are never absolute. Heroes would always attempt the impossible. Love would always drive people to challenge death. Quests would always lead to his realm. He learned to evaluate each situation individually, to grant requests that were respectful, while punishing those driven by arrogance, to maintain the sanctity of death, while acknowledging that occasionally, rarely, exceptions might be warranted. He remained consistent in his approach. Respect was rewarded with consideration. Disrespect was punished with creative cruelty. Proper procedure and honest intent could accomplish what force and trickery never could. The underworld remained the realm of death, but it wasn't completely sealed off from life. It was just very, very careful about who it let in and under what circumstances. And through all these visits, all these heroes and their quests, Hades maintained his dignity and his authority. He was king of his realm, and whether visitors came as supplicants or invaders, they would acknowledge that authority or face consequences. Death might be the great equalizer, but in the underworld, Hades's word was law. The closing: rest in the shadow of death. So close your eyes now, and let the darkness settle comfortably around you. Not frightening darkness, but restful darkness of sleep, of letting go, of accepting that you need rest, and allowing yourself to take it. Hades understood rest better than most gods. He understood that endings are necessary, that even immortals need moments of stillness, that the constant cycle of life requires moments of death-like peace to remain bearable. in his dark palace beneath the earth, beyond the rivers and past the three-headed dog, Hades sits on his throne of black stone and waits. He's patient. He's been waiting since the cosmos was divided, will wait until the cosmos ends, waits for every soul that ever lived to eventually arrive in his kingdom. He's good at waiting. It's what he does, what he's always done, what eternity requires of the God who manages death itself. And perhaps there's comfort in that certainty, in knowing that at the end of everything, there's someone waiting who will judge fairly, treat you according to how you lived, assign you to the destination you've earned, not randomly, not cruelly, not based on who you knew or how much you sacrificed to the right gods, but justly based on your actions and choices and the life you actually lived. Hades made death bearable by making it just, and in doing so, he made life more precious, because endings give meaning to middles, because knowing your actions will be evaluated makes those actions matter, because finite time is more valuable than infinite time precisely because it ends. The god of death taught the world that death didn't have to be chaos or terror or random suffering. It could be ordered, understandable, fair. He was the god nobody wanted but everyone needed, the one who did the thankless work without complaint, the one who maintained the boundary between life and death so that both could mean something. Without him, death would be formless wandering, endless confusion, no justice for the good or consequences for the wicked. With him, death was final but fair, inevitable but comprehensible. So sleep now, comfortable in darkness, resting in knowledge that endings aren't evil, that the god of death wasn't a villain despite his mistakes, that someone is managing the inevitable with patience and fairness and dignity that comes from doing necessary work without complaint for eternity. Rest easy, knowing that death, when it comes, won't be random chaos, but will be received by someone who's been preparing to receive you since before you were born. And if these old stories helped you rest, if learning about Hades and his dark kingdom brought you some peace, if drifting through myths of gods and death and the strange fate of the one who drew the shortest straw helped your mind quiet enough to sleep, then remember to like and subscribe. Not for me, but so others can find these. Myths, too, can learn about the misunderstood god, can discover that death in Greek mythology wasn't the terrifying chaos we sometimes imagine, but an ordered realm maintained by someone who cared about doing his job right. Sweet dreams. May your rest be as peaceful as the asphodel meadows, as rewarding as Elysium, and may you wake refreshed, having touched the edges of darkness and found it less frightening than expected. Because sometimes the things we fear most, when we finally look at them directly, turn out to be not monsters, but just necessary parts of existence, doing their jobs as well as they can manage, forever. The god of death watches over his kingdom still, eternal and patient, managing the dead with fairness, learned from being imprisoned himself, with dignity earned through accepting circumstances he couldn't change, with compassion born from understanding what it means to be lonely and trapped, and doing necessary work that no one celebrates. He endures because endurance is his gift, because someone has to do this work, because death is forever, and the god of death must be forever too. And somewhere in that dark realm beneath everything, Hades and Persephone rule together now, having transformed the worst beginning into something workable, if not quite ideal, having built partnership from imprisonment, having learned that even gods can grow and change and adapt when given enough time. They manage death so that we don't have to fear it quite as much, so that there's order waiting at the end, so that justice finally arrives even if it arrives in death. Good night. Rest well. Let the darkness hold you gently, and remember that Hades, king of the underworld, god of death, the one who drew the shortest straw and made the best of eternity in shadows, waits patiently for everyone eventually. And when your time comes, whenever that may be, he'll receive you fairly. That's his gift, his purpose, his eternal burden and eternal honor. Sleep now.